Scotland is back in the headlines, demanding a second independence referendum. No, says the UK government. You didn't get a majority, and it's only a few years since the last one. But let's think, if another referendum is granted, who should actually vote? Just the people of Scotland, or, given the profound impact on the rest of the United Kingdom, should we all have a vote? And if there is a vote for Scotland to leave, what does the relationship look like between a tiny new country and the rest of the UK? What currency would they use? What military support will they need and we be prepared to give? And will they need passports, let alone vaccine passports, to travel to England? Well, we talked to two former Scottish politicians, Michelle Ballantyne and Brian Monteith, who got long experience over the last 20 years of this ongoing debate. If you thought the EU referendum was divisive, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is Tice Talk. Hello and welcome. Well, the UK elections are a recent memory, but they certainly kept politicians busy across the country, visiting businesses, care homes, kissing babies, generally lobbying everyone for as many votes as possible. And the elections inevitably threw up some interesting results, keenly awaited, most of all perhaps in Scotland. Because despite having promised during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum that it was a once-in-a-generation decision that would settle the matter once and for all, in the run-up to these Scottish elections, of course, talk of independence has raised its head once again, loud and clear. There's been months of speculation about whether if Scotland achieves a super majority, then that gives it the right to have another referendum. Well, sadly for Nicola Sturgeon, her balloon was burst. Boris Johnson has said there's no way he could countenance a second referendum based on the numbers, and that of course should be the end of the matter. But as with anything with Scotland, it's never quite as simple as that. Well, joining me to discuss this in more detail and to surgically analyse the situation is my good friend, Dr. David Bull. And David, to continue the medical metaphor a little bit further, I mean, this is like amputating a limb from the human body, and any such operation, of course, is likely to be painful and require a lot of anaesthetic, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. You know, look, as a doctor, amputation is always a last resort. What we have to do here is to look after the patient. And what this patient needs is resuscitation. Actually, I'm not sure it does need resuscitation. It just needs some tender, loving care. It needs to be done very carefully and gently. But remember, and this is so crucial, that the union, the sum of those constituent nations, is so much more than those individual nations together. So it is critical that we get the patient back up and running and at full strength.
Excellent. And so let's remind ourselves, the SNP, they did well in their results. Let's just look at the results and remind ourselves exactly how well they did.
Yeah, well, the SNP, as you say, did incredibly well. They actually won 64 seats, and that is one more than they had before. But crucially, it is one short of this supermajority that you talk about. And the reason that this is important is not having a majority is really a major problem. And the SNP therefore has to rely on other parties to get their various votes through. And the one more point that I would make about this is, and this is why I'm so angry about the whole campaign. Now, if you remember, the SNP was insistent when campaigning that voting for them was not a vote for independence. And yet, now that they've actually won, they've changed their tune, saying, well, obviously everyone voted for us, so now there is overwhelming support for independence. And that is simply not true. It is a lie.
Exactly. But of course, they will then say, yes, but the Scottish Greens, they want a vote on independence as well. So this is an ongoing complex issue. And of course, what it's done, David, is it's completely distracted the debate from the performance of actually running Scotland under an SNP government. And I know you've got some pretty clear views on that you want to share with everyone.
Yeah, I have. You're right. It's like, a great magic trick. Look over here whilst we actually don't show you what we've done. Their target, their record, the SNP's record in government is atrocious, actually. The target, the 95% of A&E patients should be seen within 4 hours, hasn't been met for over 2 years. The mortality in poorer areas of Scotland is much higher than in other areas of the United Kingdom. They have the highest drug death rate in the EU. Students are getting a really bad deal. Education is shocking. Police stations leaking and crumbling. I mean, do I need to go on? Employment, far worse than in the rest of the Union. So the SNP hasn't done a very good job.
I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds a shocking track record. Of course, they would defend them. And I should say, actually, that we did ask an SNP MP to come on the show, but
too busy talking about independence.
Well, they didn't even have the courtesy to reply, let alone accept or deny. So we've got all this chat, and you thought the EU issue and referendum and negotiations were difficult and divisive after 40 years. Just imagine how difficult and divisive this will be, having been together, as you rightly say, as a big, loving family for over 300 years. There's so much to consider. There really is, from family to businesses to currency, that we're going to talk about. The issues are really complex.
Yeah, they are. Like many of us, I have Scottish blood, I have Irish blood, I have English blood. It is integral in all of us. And people haven't really thought this through at all. I always think independence, they sort of see themselves holding a sword standing on a rock. But there are some very complex issues that need to be thought through. I think, actually, that, no one really knows what would happen. How would Scotland be funded? Because, quite frankly, it doesn't have the money to be self-sufficient. The Barnett formula would not exist. What currency are they using? They can't therefore use the pound. Are they going to use the EU? No, the euro? No, they can't, because they're not in the EU. What happens to businesses? What happens about a border? I mean, all these things. No one's thought it through.
The consequences are huge, not only for Scotland, but for the citizens across the whole of the UK. And that's why what I'm keen to discuss with our first guest, actually, are issues around who actually has the right to vote in this. Is it just the citizens of Scotland, or actually is it the citizens of the whole of the UK? Because it's such a big, profound issue. Well, I'm looking forward to this next discussion with our first guest. Thank you very much, David. Well, to hear more about the very real issues and problems that Scotland faces, and to give us a sense of the mood in Scotland, I'm delighted to welcome Michelle Ballantyne, leader of Reform Scotland. So, Michelle, welcome to Tice Talk.
Morning, Richard.
And post the elections, be really great just to get your sense of what's the mood in Scotland, the response post the elections, and how much appetite there really is to keep discussing a referendum, independence, or whether actually to focus on the real day-to-day issues, focusing that people need to hear about.
Yeah, well, the mood is slightly strange. The whole election was always a slight sort of anticlimax, if you like. It was a funny election. It was quiet. But it was very centred. I mean, all the main parties made it about independence. But if you look at the feedback from polls, etc., from the people, it's quite clear that independence is not top of everybody's list. What everybody's really concerned about is getting back to normal, is to going back to socialising, being able to visit their friends and families, getting schools open and sorted so that our children can have the decent education they want. There isn't that sense that it's all about independence. And certainly, out talking to people, most people don't really believe that we would vote for independence if it came to it anyway. So I think there's been quite a false premise on which this election has been held.
I mean, Michelle,
David, go for it.
Going to say to you, the SNP seems absolutely obsessed by independence. Rich and I were talking about it just now, saying they said if you vote for them, that wasn't a vote for independence, and yet they're still trying to push the independence manifesto. But no one seems to have thought through what independence really would mean, like, for example, to businesses, to tourism, freedom of movement, whether you'd need a passport. Do you think this is just an arbitrary concept?
I think you have to remember two things. The SNP is founded on the basis of independence. So it doesn't matter what they say about what their motive is. It's always going to be about independence because that's their raison d'etre. Remove that and they're not who they say they are. But the problem is the opposition also founded their whole campaign on independence as well. So you had the Conservatives and Labour trying to walk away from it a bit, but predominantly the Conservatives as the main opposition also founding their whole campaign on independence. So they're all as bad as each other when it comes to talking about it. But in terms of whether people have thought about it, I think people have given more thought to it than quite often the press give the Scottish people credit for. And a lot of those that vote for the SNP would no more vote for independence right now than they would sort of,
Interesting.
I suppose, for somebody else.
Interesting.
This voting for the SNP isn't necessarily agreeing with independence. And this is something that's often forgotten. So at the moment, we're very much still in the same position. If you had a referendum tomorrow, it would almost certainly be straight back into the 40 to 50% in favour of staying in the union. Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting because, of course, actually, there was a fair percentage of SNP voters that actually voted for Brexit, and Nicola Sturgeon seems to completely gloss over that. And as you say, I think the other issue is that in the rest of the UK, most people actually have not really paid that much attention to the detail of the issues. But of course, actually, the impact on the whole of the UK would be really, really profound. I use the sort of the human body analogy that, in a sense, each of the four nations is like a limb on the human body. The human body's been there together for 300 years. And I don't think most people have really thought about what's the impact on the whole of the UK. And therefore, actually, and I think when people do appreciate that, actually, I think people say, well, hang on, I need a say in this. Whether I live in England or Wales, because it's going to impact on all of us. If you chop the limb off a body, it's going to hurt the limb and it's going to hurt the rest of the body.
I think the franchise is probably one of the most debated subjects amongst certainly the people I talk to, and particularly because I live in the borders, so I'm in what they now call the Blue Belt, where this one little strap of Scotland that votes Conservative, but that Blue Belt very much discuss ad infinitum what would happen in terms of the rest of the UK, and particularly David mentioned the freedom of movement, the freedom of business across the border, and that is absolutely essential to operations in the south of Scotland and would not be given away lightly. But I think the key here is to think about it when you think about it in the round. When the union was formed, it didn't have these component parts that everybody is now talking about. It wasn't broken up in that way. There wasn't a closed border. The union was simply formed for a degree of convenience and for the functional operation of the United Kingdom as it became. But we have, over the last 300 years, built things like our NATO Defence Force, and we have that Northern Shield sits up here. So, are we going to remove that? Question mark. And that would obviously affect the rest of the UK. Personally, I think they'd just move it further north because the Shetlands and Co would probably say, well, we're not going to be part of the United Kingdom. We'll be a separate bit up there. But fundamentally, this is the issue as to why I don't ultimately believe if we have an independence referendum, Scotland would ever vote, even just as Scotland, to say, no, we want to be alone. Because we have too many things that are intertwined, too many things that people would lose. And when actually push comes to shove and they're faced with it, they're not going to do that because it's not in their personal interests. And people ultimately vote for what's in their personal interests.
I mean, my real worry is if we open this out to the rest of the United Kingdom, there is a sense here in England and in Wales that they are sick and tired of hearing about Scotland wanting to be independent. And my nervousness is that even those people who believe in the union may well think, well, actually, we'd be better off without Scotland.
Yes, I mean, having said that, there is, of course, there's been so little debate south of the border about all of the implications, and I think when people really hear what's involved and what are the risks, then I think people would assess actually there's a real cost to this, and it affects us all. And so I think that on that basis, people elsewhere in the UK might say, actually, no, there's real painful consequences that we shouldn't entertain.
But it's not, I mean, if you turn it on its head, it's not just about risk, it's about benefits. It's about how we operate as a whole. I mean, together, the United Kingdom is quite a powerful body within the world. If you divide it up, we're not such a powerful body. Together, we share the wealth that we create. And there is a bit of give and take. There is a bit of fluidity in that wealth. When Scotland was doing well and it had oil, and there was quite a lot being, wealth being pumped out, the whole of the United Kingdom benefit. Now Scotland doesn't have that. The flow is the other way, with some support from the rest of the United Kingdom to the well-being of Scotland. And I think it is that wealth sharing that, ironically, the left talk about all the time. They want wealth redistribution and the sharing of wealth. Well, that is exactly what the United Kingdom does. We share risk, we share benefit, and by doing so, we keep the whole steady and, on the whole, very, very well looked after. And I think, it's very interesting. This morning, they were looking at child poverty figures. Devolution, which is supposed to improve things in Scotland, has the worst child poverty figures than the rest of the UK. Yeah. So clearly, some of that benefit of looking after yourself is not working. Now, I would put that down to the kind of policy base that's being delivered. But I definitely think if you cut us off, yes, both sides will lose. You'll lose our whiskey. That'll become more expensive, which clearly is not a good thing.
Now things are really getting serious, Michelle. No, you're absolutely right. I mean,
absolutely. You've got to think about the important things.
That's a great way to.
But our food and drink sector is valuable, and our defence shield is valuable. But we also give to each other lots of things, and I think it is that sharing. It's the positives that actually we need to think about.
And to conclude, in the sense. That feeling of being one big family that have been together for so many hundreds of years, have loved together, fought together, worked together, invested together, and yes, the frustrations. But look, Michelle, that's a fantastic update on where you see things at the moment. This debate, we could talk about it all day. There's no question. The UK will be talking about it for many years. But great to see you. Great to have those thoughts. Thank you very much indeed, Michelle. Well, David, that was fascinating, getting a latest update from Michelle. Any particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right that in Scotland, independence is not a massive issue. It's not what people are talking about. And actually, if you look at the latest polling, which is the Savanta ComRes poll, 62% of people actually want to stay within the union. Where there is a change is it's younger people, 16 to 35-year-olds, that may want independence. But of course, as they get older, as they consider all those things we've talked about, that may change.
And I thought there was a fascinating observation from Michelle about what would the impact be for the rest of the UK around the world if Scotland went independent. And that's the perfect topic, actually, to introduce our next guest on the show, a man who's, as a former Holyrood politician, as a former MEP with us in Brussels during the Brexit process, someone who's been commentating and very close to the whole independence debate for many, many years, Brian Monteith. Brian, welcome to Tice Talk. Great to have you with us, and looking forward to your thoughts. The impact, I don't think, is properly understood and discussed, Brian, about what would be the effect on the whole of the UK in the event that Scotland was to go independent. And in particular, actually, Brian, your thoughts on what would the rest of the world, whether it's the UN, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, what would happen to the UK's perception in their eyes?
Well, I think one has to consider that it's a very hard world that we live in, and that there are many actors out there who would look to take advantage of the UK breaking up to the extent of Scotland seceding. They would look to challenge the importance of the UK being in, for instance, a permanent seat at the Security Council in the UN. It would certainly be presented as a moral blow to the importance of the UK and its world standing, and all sorts of national interests would, even from friends such as the EU, would seek to use it as an opportunity to undermine the importance of the UK. So it would have ramifications beyond just what might happen in Scotland, but also into how the stature of the UK would be.
And I think that's.
I was going to
David,
say,
go for it.
Brian, you were there with us in Brussels. We've seen firsthand how tricky it is if you do decide to leave an organisation. When we left the European Union, just how complex it's been. You know, to get the deal, as bad as it is, through was very tricky in the first place. And of course, we've seen with the Northern Ireland Protocol how difficult and how that agreement isn't working. I mean, clearly, no one's actually thought through how difficult it would be to extricate Scotland after 300 years.
Well, an attempt was once made in 2014 for that referendum, when in the SNP's white paper, it was suggested that it would take something like 18 months to negotiate a Scottish departure from the UK, and to set up the institutions that would be required would cost in the region of £250 million. Now, of course, we can see in hindsight that was just absolute nonsense. We're talking about a union that has existed over 300 years, where the relationships and the businesses and the institutions are so embedded that we never really think of a great deal about those differences, but we would have to start thinking about them.
I mean, that would be...
And so to compare it with a union that would... Yeah, we've left a union that was 40 years in the making. And so there's no comparison. It would be hugely problematic and time-consuming and expensive.
I mean, the expression I use, if you thought the EU, leaving the EU was difficult and divisive, trying to extricate Scotland from the rest of the UK after 300 years, you ain't seen nothing yet. And let's just explore some of those issues, Brian. I mean, just last week we had, for example, mob rule exerting itself in Glasgow when there was the issue of deporting the legal deportation proposed of 2 illegal immigrants who had well overstayed their right to stay in the UK. And essentially mob rule overcame the enforcement officers. And so, is Scotland going to have a completely different immigration policy?
Well, there are great complications that generally have not been thought about, and so it was dismissed previously. Oh, there'd be no problem with freedom of movement, no problem with we wouldn't need a border. But of course, if you are going to have different immigration policies between a nascent and a new Scotland and the rest of the UK, with a proper land border that exists, it's quite different from the current sea border between the island of Ireland and the island of Greater Britain. Now, we can have a common travel agreement and it can work because we have points of where travel can be checked between Ireland and Great Britain. But if we were to have different immigration policies in Scotland, then we would actually have those policies having to be checked across the border. Not just the roads, not just the 2 railway lines, but to avoid the problem of trafficking of migrants from Scotland to England, there would actually have to be a firm physical border. That's the reality, and it's not generally talked about. But if Scotland was to become some sort of state which allowed anyone and everyone to come in, then clearly that would not be acceptable to the rest of the UK. And so a firm physical border would have to be created.
I think the other big thing for me, Brian, which no one talks about, is actually the whole military side of things. Because obviously, we've got to, the role of the UK government, one of its most fundamental roles, is to keep the UK citizens safe. And, we need to know that, in a sense, an independent Scotland, how's it going to protect itself? Or if it suddenly, it would be, as a small nation, financially, is it going to be able to defend itself? And obviously what we, the rest of the UK, could not entertain is the risk that any other less than friendly state could come into Scotland and help them with cheap technology and cheap finance. But all of a sudden, actually, we're put at risk. Do you think essentially we, the rest of the UK, would have to provide umbrella military support as part of any exit deal of Scotland?
Well, there's some, again, big strategic issues in regard to defending the remainder of the UK. Because at the moment, for instance, we regularly have the buzzing of British airspace by the Russians, constantly prodding and testing our defences, and we send up Typhoon fighters and such like, and we've been doing it since the days of the Lightnings, to see them off, to tell them that we're watching them, and they used to be based at Lookers and now based up at Lossiemouth. How would that now happen? Would Russian aircraft be allowed into Scottish airspace? Or if not, would a Scottish Air Force have the capability to protect airspace? But what would be the approaches to? So there are questions that are just not being talked about, not being thought about. All we ever hear about is the removal of Trident. Some people in the nationalist movement talk about auctioning a lease, making it a Guantanamo type of deal where Trident would remain. And of course, they're attracted by any financial inducement that might bring. But the reality is that defence goes far beyond just Trident, and Scotland being the northern part of the UK boundary, both in sea and in air, that would have to be thought about too, and how that would be defended.
I just think it's a completely unacceptable risk for the remaining 62 million citizens of the UK to have our northern border that we've historically always protected to be so exposed with no control. I mean, in my view, then actually, the nuclear bases, we should lease those for a peppercorn for 999-year lease, and that would be an absolute fundamental precondition. And I think when the rest of the UK citizens think about it, I think we would say we've got to provide the overarching military protection, including for Scotland, in return for a financial contribution, to make sure that we all share that benefit and we don't suffer that risk. Have you got any thoughts on that, Brian?
Well, of course, this then comes back to sovereignty. I mean, this is what the Scottish nationalists claim is the fundamental issue about taking back control, as they see it, about taking decisions for themselves, and for Scots to do this. But of course, these are the same people in the main who wish to then give sovereignty over to the EU. So it's hardly independence. But in the sense of defence, the current SNP position is to join NATO. But we know that was a grudging choice. And there would undoubtedly be the case where future Scottish governments could not be trusted, I believe, to want to remain in NATO. So yes, there would be a need before any settlement of secession to come to terms with how the defence of the rest of the UK could be organised. Now, of course, there's another factor, and that is what would happen to Orkneys and Shetlands. Would Orkney and Shetland possibly vote against independence? Would it vote to stay in the UK? And if so, would that then offer an opportunity to for the UK to say, yes, be part of the UK, remain there. And of course, we can then better protect the rest of the UK, both at sea and in air. There's all sorts of scenarios that could open up because many parts of Scotland would not vote for secession.
I mean, the complexities when you really get into it are huge. We haven't even touched on, and you know, we're going to run out of time on this show. We haven't touched on the issue of the share of the UK's national debt that Scotland would have to take, which obviously would be very significant. We haven't touched on what would happen with financial services, whether we would grant some form of equivalence deal, tariffs, quotas. I mean, the list is endless, isn't it? I mean, it really is. And the negotiations to come up with some exit deal not only would be incredibly complicated, very difficult and divisive, and take a long time, don't you think, Brian?
I certainly think any negotiations would take a long time. I think they'd be highly complex because I think new difficulties would appear once people start to think about it. I think that's why it makes sense in any referendum that might be in the future, and I think it'd be a long time before there is anyone, that we actually have a new set of rules for the whole of the UK that determines how referenda will be held. For instance, it might be better, I think preferable, to have an act. So you're actually voting
on a deal.
Just on the issue of independence, you're actually voting on the deal.
In a sense, that would
see whether.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, that would learn the lesson from the EU shenanigans. We're running out of time, Brian. We're going to have to leave it there for this time. But some really useful thoughts to chew over. Thank you very much indeed for that. This subject is going to run and run for many years to come, and we'll come back to it. Brian Monteith, a huge thanks.
Thanks very much.
Fascinating with Brian. David, final thoughts on this difficult issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian says it all. The more you think about this, the fact is that it basically is a Pandora's box. Once you solve one problem, another one arises, and you suddenly realise that actually disentangling 300 years of history isn't going to be incredibly complex. And we certainly can't fall into the trap that we did with the EU. And I think that is the key message. We need people to understand why the union is so important and why we must preserve it.
The complexities are absolutely huge, and it's going to take a long time, really, for that to digest. Well, that's all we've got time for on this week's show on this critical issue of the Union and Scotland. My thanks to our special guests, Michelle Ballantyne and Brian Monteith, for their thoughts. Of course, thank you to you, David, for being with me, talking about amputations and all sorts this week. And join us next week for plenty more politics, views, opinions, ideas. Until then, goodbye.